Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we think again about the Bible on women and men, and we start with the correct understanding of what happened in the Garden of Eden, back in the beginning. Today we'll be hearing from Bruce C.E. Fleming. He's a former academic dean and professor of practical theology. The work of the True 316 Foundation is based on the research of Dr. Joy Fleming, who wrote the book Man and Woman in Biblical Unity, Theology from Genesis 2 to 3. Listeners like you are joining us as members of the True 316 Foundation and support the work to true the verse of Genesis 3:16 and the 7 key passages on women and men. It turns out, when Genesis 3:16 becomes clear, all the other passages become clear too. You can learn more at our website, true316.com. That's TRU316.com. And at the end of this episode, we'll tell you about a special gift we have for new members. And now, enjoy today's episode of the Eden Podcast.
On the last episode of Season 9, titled Joy Story, I interviewed Dr. Joy Fleming as she recounted how God led her to study Genesis chapters 2 and 3 for her doctoral dissertation at the University of Strasbourg, France. If you'd like to get a copy of her dissertation, visit our website at true316.com/shop. After teaching in French-speaking Africa as professor of Old Testament studies, when we returned to the States, she was asked to condense her 407-page dissertation for the average reader. She did, and it appeared as her book, Man and Woman in Biblical Unity, Theology from Genesis 2 to 3. We're serializing that book for Season 10 on the Eden Podcast. Episode A Prime, Part 1, The Interrogation, Chapter 3, verses 8 to 13. By way of structure, Episode A Prime, 3, 8 to 24, is the longest in the story. It falls naturally into 3 parts. Part 1, 8 to 13, The Interrogation. Part 2, 14 to 19, God as Judge and Prophet. Part 3, 20 to 24, The Aftermath and Expulsion from Eden. The distress of the shame experienced by the man and the woman becomes compounded as God approaches to meet with them. Having constructed crude garments behind which to hide from one another, they physically attempt to hide from the presence of God. An inquiry ensues for the purpose of bringing matters out into the open. God addresses the two who partook of the fruit in the chronological order in which they received the divine command. The man responds to God by describing his fear and shame. I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. This response evokes 2 questions submitted back to back. Who told you you were naked? Expects a person to be named in response. Did you eat? Gives the man a chance to confess his transgression. God is giving him the opportunity to correctly identify the source of the sin and admit his own guilt. At this moment, there are 4 personalities in the story. The man could point to himself. He had made his own wayward choice. Or he could point to the serpent, attributing to him, appropriately enough, his responsibility in being the tempter and the enemy. What is the man's response? He mentions neither of these. Instead, he attempts to implicate the other 2 persons in the story. It is true that the woman had given him the fruit, but not maliciously, not with the intent of the tempter. He points a finger nonetheless at her. In verse 12 he begins, the woman. Then audaciously sliding his finger from the woman to God, he wags his finger at God, the woman whom you gave to be with me. Such audacious barbs in retort to God's questions come from a person who had hardened his heart and sinned knowingly. The New Testament confirms that he was not deceived. 1 Timothy 2:14. He ate the fruit with his eyes open, that is, with full and conscious awareness of what he was doing. The woman, in response to God's inquiry, replies in 3 Hebrew words, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. She points to the serpent, describes accurately what he did to her, deceived her, and acknowledges her act of objective guilt. The woman and the man both admit to having eaten, but there is a notable difference. One takes a very circuitous route in that admission. The man blames his human colleague and then God, The woman and the man each transgressed God's command. Both were guilty of doing what they understood God had told them not to do. For this they each would die. Yet there's a difference in their understanding, and thus a distinguishable difference in the guilt of each. For the man was not deceived by the serpent. He deliberately and consciously dethroned God from his proper and rightful place as sovereign of his life. This was the first step toward a new authority system replacing the one God had established. Then, in his response to God's questions, the man assumed the role of accuser. He seized the moment to make clear that he was aligning himself against God. Nor did he act in this crucial moment as one might expect of a one-flesh partner. His stance became combative, accusatory. This was the second step toward a new hierarchy of male over female as he distanced himself from the woman and from God in an aggressive way. And what of the woman? It is often assumed in the context of the man's blame-shifting that she followed suit. But that may not be the case. Her reply held no words of self-justification. She told the truth. And the New Testament commentary on this episode bears out this understanding. Eve is mentioned by name in the New Testament twice, and both times her deception is attested. 2 Corinthians 11:3 and 1 Timothy 2:14 both convey that she was deceived. Episode A', Part 2, God as Judge and Prophet, Chapter 3, verses 14 to 19. God is the sole speaker in this section, and he addresses the transgressors in the sequence of their disobedience, the serpent, the woman, then the man. The text is quite straightforward, yet the disparity of interpretation throughout history makes these verses among the thorniest in biblical interpretation, no pun intended. It may prove helpful to precede our analysis of the text with some general observations. 1. An important purpose of the speeches is to describe how the consequence of sin, death, will affect the man and the woman. Already they have been told, in 2:16 and 17, that the wages of sin is death. It had been stated emphatically, surely die. But not having experienced death before, and finding themselves yet alive, they may be wondering what the experience of death will bring. Perhaps they are anticipating a summary execution. The fruit didn't kill them. Maybe God will exterminate them himself. In any event, God explains to them in these speeches what they can expect life to be like now that they inhabit death bodies. 2. It is helpful to distinguish between this already certain consequence of sin, death, on the one hand, and additional special acts of God subsequent to the fall, including the curses on the other hand. Some of what he explains to them, explaining both the man's physical disintegration and the woman's effort in childbearing, is the former, the product of having bodies that are now mortal and dying. Other information in the speeches, the serpent's traveling on his belly and thorns and thistles from the ground, is related to the latter. Additional acts of God, curses, subsequent to the disobedience by the man and the woman. The curses and the consequence of the disobedience, which is death, are not to be confused. 3. It is important to note the number and specific nature of the curses. It is widely supposed that God cursed the serpent, the woman, and the man, or that the whole passage is the curse. Some expositors use the word curse to describe anything bad that happens in Genesis 3. This is sloppy exegesis. In fact, there are 2 curses pronounced, no more and no less. They are very specific. The serpent is cursed in verse 14. The ground is cursed in verse 17. Neither the man nor the woman, who were blessed in the beginning, 1:28, are the objects of God's cursing. They are affected by the curse on the ground, but they themselves, including their bodies, are not cursed. 4. It is helpful to identify an expression of hope in the middle speech, Genesis 3:16. The original creation blessing in Genesis 1:28 is never rescinded in Genesis 3. And while God had charged them at that time to be fruitful and multiply, here God makes a commitment to the woman to multiply her offspring. Furthermore, the woman's offspring will not only be numerous, but her offspring will take on the tempter of the garden and decisively crush his head. The first and third speeches, Genesis 3:14 to 15 and 17 to 19. From a structural standpoint, there is remarkable correspondence between God's addresses to the serpent and to the man. Specifically, they follow the same pattern. 1. Both speeches open with the word because, Hebrew ki. That introductory word serves to justify the additional punishments he's about to inflict on the serpent and on the man. 2. Next, in both speeches, one specific curse, Hebrew arur, is pronounced. In this text, a curse is always clearly indicated by the word curse. Where the word curse is absent, there is no curse. The word arur occurs no place else in this passage. 3. In both speeches, the specific object of the curse is identified. In the former, the serpent is cursed. In the latter, the ground is cursed. Cursed are you, God says to the serpent in verse 14. In verse 17, cursed is the ground because of you, he says to the man. God levies these two curses, one on the serpent, one on the ground. The serpent was the tool of the tempter, and that tool is henceforth cursed. The ground is cursed because of the man, and the man is profoundly impacted by that decree, but the man himself is not cursed. In each case, the objects cursed were chosen by God because they were related to the misdeeds of the wrongdoers. God says to the serpent and to the man, because you have done this, and one could add, cursed is the instrument of your sin. 4. The nature of each curse involves eating. The serpent will eat dust. The man will eat the plants of the field and bread by the sweat of your face, literally nose. There is an interesting bit of irony built into the text with the use of the words dust and eat. The man was made from dust, and he will return to dust. Now, dust is what the cursed animal will be eating. Interestingly, eating was what brought about the transgression in the first place, that which the serpent wished to tempt them both to do. So the animal who succeeded in getting them to eat will now himself be eating dust. 5. There is a note of duration in both speeches, all the days of your life. 6. At the end of each speech, there is a repeated verb, and the corresponding verbs in each segment sound alike. To the serpent, God said, he will bruise, Hebrew is shuf, you on the head, and you shall bruise, shuf, him on the heel. To the man, God said, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return, shuv, to the ground, and to the dust you shall return, shuv. This alliterative word interplay, shuf, shuf, shuv, shuv, is a deliberate stylistic device employed by the author, perhaps to aid in the memorization of these lines. To summarize, the structure of the speech to the serpent in verses 14 and 15 and the speech to the man in verses 17 to 19 correspond to one another. These speeches follow the same pattern. Each speech contains the same Hebrew words delineating the reason for the curse using the word because, in Hebrew ki, followed by a description of that party's wrongdoing. Cursed, the Hebrew word arur. Who or what God is cursing, the serpent in the ground. A description of how the curses affect eating and involve dust. The duration of the curses, all the days of your life. And repeating alliterative verbs, shuf shuf, shuv shuv, which describe the ending implications. After noticing this clear pattern in God's words to two of the three parties in the garden, what is striking in Genesis 3:16, God's words to the woman, is that this pattern is totally absent. God does not say to the woman, because you have done this. No curse is pronounced on the woman or even because of the woman. Nothing is said about eating or dust, and the phrase, all the days of your life, is omitted. Nor is there any alliterative verb repetition at the end. Why is there no curse in the speech to the woman when each of the other speeches contains one? The best explanation seems to be that indicated in verse 13. The woman was deceived. She was not a malicious partner with the serpent trying to get the man to fall. Though she was responsible for her own sin, the serpent was the tempter. He tried to induce the two to sin. It was a malicious act on his part. As for the man, though he was a target and victim of the serpent's tempting, he sinned willfully. The common thread between the serpent and the man is the deliberate nature of their rebellion against God. Unlike the woman who believed the serpent's deception, the man and the serpent acted in wanton and willful disregard for God. So God inflicted curses as punishments because of those who deliberately did evil. But why, one might wonder, would God utter curses anyhow? These additional acts of God are not levied simply for the annoyance of those affected by them, though they will certainly make life harder. They serve, rather, as pedagogical tools. 1. They instruct that God is capable of anger, and that he judges, not just external disobedience as the woman, but additionally the inner intents and motives. Hence the serpent and the man merit curses. 2. The curses instruct that God is not indifferent concerning the well-being of those he has created, the subjects of his kingdom, and he has a particular regard and love for the human beings he specially made by the work of his hands. He could have cursed the man as he did the serpent, but he desires to act in grace, to spare the humans of all he in justice can spare them. 3. The curses further teach that it is not in the best interest of beings created by God to revolt against God's complete and sovereign rulership. 4. The curses will also henceforth serve as reminders of the human condition. Man's or woman's usurpation of the place of God results in misery.
Thanks for listening to the Eden Podcast, brought to you by the members of the True 316 Foundation. Research into the Old and New Testaments by Dr. Joy Fleming and Reverend Bruce C.E. Fleming forms the base of all our work. Joy is a former Old Testament professor and is a practicing licensed psychologist. Bruce is the author of the Eden Book series, which starts with Book 1, the Book of Eden, Genesis 2-3. We invite you to become a donor member of the True 316 Foundation, as together we seek to true the verse of Genesis 3:16 and related passages. When you become a member, we'll send you an autographed copy of the Book of Eden. Sign up today by going to true316.com/member. That's TRU316.com/member.